Well, I have finally measured this, managed to get this out tonight. I really apologize. I had all kinds of technical difficulties. I couldn't get the screen wide enough. I think we have it now. Not so much that you had to see me, but I couldn't even get the PowerPoint slide set up. So I think we're in pretty good shape. And I'm going to go forward. Again, apologize for being late, but we'll have this on. So let's move forward here and look at our questions that we want to speak to tonight, and try to get that ironed out as quickly as we can. What's the nature of conflict in organizations? How can conflict be managed? What is the nature of negotiation in organizations? And then finally, what are alternative strategies for negotiation? So I don't think we're completely on the screen, so I'm going to be moving some of this around tonight as we go through. So please bear with me. Conflict occurs when there's some kind of disagreement. I mean, it's as simple as that. I don't think we have to talk too much about it. We can understand that. The slide says there's kind of some kind of friction, and of course there is. It can be over goals. It can be over any number of type things. Substantive, as we talk here in the first bullet here. We're talking about goals, and there's some question about disagreement, how we're going to get there, what it is we have to do, et cetera, et cetera. So here we're looking about accomplishment, and that's kind of a thing that can be managed. We can talk about this as long as we're focusing on the disagreement, we're focusing on the issue. But when we get to the next point, the emotional point, here we have people that may not even have a basis for it. It's things over somebody's angry with somebody else. They don't like them. There's a deep-seated mistrust with people. They may resent somebody because he or she's in a different position. They think they ought to be in that position. So a lot of foolishness. That's not a good word to use. Let me back off of that. But there's some issues here that really, in many cases, don't have a basis in fact. Now, here's the point. Yes, you're angry with somebody. Yes, you distrust somebody. But if you can put those aside and talk about issues, then you can do something. But when you can't put those things aside, that's when we have problems, and that's when it becomes a real issue for us to try to move forward. This is a quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes. I believe that we're talking here about not his father, but the gentleman who was Justice of the United States Supreme Court for around 30 years, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, but not a whole lot. What he's saying here is that we ought to welcome conflict because it makes us do some things, makes us think of things perhaps a little differently than what we ordinarily would. And so if we welcome conflict and it's substantive, it's not emotional, we should be able to do something about it. Now, this particular slide talks about the 4 levels, it says, maybe types is a better word, of conflict in organizations. And here we're talking about interpersonal, intrapersonal, intergroup, and then interorganizational. And we can kind of talk about each one of these. We can look at the top of page 221. It shows this is it's not a figure, but it shows that. And here, interpersonal is the easiest, between two people. Intrapersonal is a problem that I have within myself because I'm not sure of the goals, pardon me, the expectations, etc. And notice that with this particular type of conflict, there are three ways that we can try to alleviate that. And the text shows these on page 221. The first is known as an approach type of conflict. So you can do this. And this is a thing that's known as a positive. You're selecting between two positive and, as the slide here says, equally attractive alternatives. Avoidance is two negatives. That's something you probably want to do, so you probably got to think about staying away from that. And then approach avoidance is another issue. Very good. By the way, the text gives examples of each one of these, but I think the one they give for this approach avoidance is probably the best. I've been selected for a promotion, but if I take this promotion, I'm going to have to not be able to see my children play ball. I'm not going to be able to attend some of my children's events. I'm not going to be able to spend as much time as I like with my spouse, et cetera, et cetera. So here we have something that's really good on one side and not so good on the other. Intergroup, here we're looking at resources. And we know, and we should know, and if we don't know, we need to think about this. There's a finite amount of resources floating around in this world. And people in the organizations are always trying to get after these. And so in some fashion, there's going to be some squabble over that. And then the last one, interorganizational. This could be competition for market share. It could be any other type of competition that you want to think, but it's between two organizations. Now, we're carrying on here with kind of what we talked about before. If you want to keep substantive and emotional in your mind, these two that we're going to talk about fall into this category. And we're going to look at this on a graph or a figure that we find on page 222, figure 10.1. Functional is something that's constructive. Notice here it talks about positive to the organization, that we can look at things. And it could be positive to individuals, it could be positive to teams, etc. Dysfunctional it's exactly what it says. It's destructive. There is nothing good that can come out of this. Because destructive, and we're going to look at this figure here, and I'll try to like blow that up just a little bit for you, so you can see a little bit better here. And it talks about, if you look about impact of performance on the left-hand side, intensity to conflict on the bottom, and we see that too little or too much conflict is what is known as destructive, where moderate levels of conflict are considered to be constructive. And in the dysfunctional or destructive end, we have things that boil over to personalities. It could be a dispute between goals and between team members about goals and objectives and how to get there, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the best thing to think about this is we have constructive conflict. That is where, and I'm going to talk about this probably, or reemphasize this probably many times as we go through this chapter late this afternoon, early this evening. And that is, when we're in some type of constructive conflict, we're focusing on the merits of issues. We're not here now talking about, yes, there are differences, but we're focused on that. We're not into personalities. We're not into other type things. We're into things that we can control. It's difficult to control emotions. I can't control somebody else's emotions, and you can't control mine. So we have to think about that. And I'm only using that on the emotional thing. So we shouldn't really have problems with constructive conflict. Now we're going to talk about some potential benefits of constructive functional or constructive conflict. You can see here that problems come to the surface, things that we need to talk about. We can consider our decision processes. We have more information because different people are bringing pieces of information into the scenario. We should be able to select a good answer based upon that, choose one prize. And notice the last one, it provides opportunities for creativity. But here again, we're talking about something that's constructive or functional, however you want to look at that, whatever word appeals to you. We're keeping the bounds, we're keeping the conflict within certain parameters. We're not letting it get out here to the periphery where we might have trouble handling it. Now, there's really nothing good that's going to come out of a dysfunctional conflict. And everything that we see listed here is really a downer. Distorts vision, distorts relationships. It increases emotions, a lot of negativity, a lot of negative energy. It decreases the sense of purpose in input, which leads to a loss. And notice the last down here, and by the way, this is in the text. If we have this type of conflict, it can lead to increased absenteeism and turnover, something no organization can afford because it causes us problems, causes us money when we have to go out and hire new people. Well, this is something we really have to be careful about. That's culture and the differences in the conflict, and we have to really pay attention to that to make sure that we're not using our culture as a focal point to cause arguments with someone else, and vice versa. We have to make sure that that's not happening from that person's viewpoint. So we have to be, I think the key word here is sensitivity. We need to be sensitive to the other, whatever the other happens to be. And we would hope that the other would be sensitive to us as well. So it's a two-way street. It's not just, hey, ugly American, which was a very popular term back in the late 1950s, early 1960s. We don't have to look at ourselves here as being ugly Americans. What we have to look at ourselves here is being able to make sure that we're getting these things across and working in the ways that we need to work. And of course, we're going to talk about this a little bit later about low context organizations and low context cultures and countries when we get into communication. So we can keep some of these two chapters really go along real well with each other, I think. Conflict resolution, pretty much what it is. We're just here trying to remove the issues, if you will, or the reasons that cause the conflict. Now, notice we're talking about remove. The slide uses the term eliminate. And I want you to keep that in your mind as we go through the rest of this chapter this evening. We're talking here about elimination. We're not talking about anything other than that. These things have to be addressed. They have to be resolved or eliminated. Now, figure 10.2, which we can see in the text. Let me switch over, get the right page on page 225. Gives us the stages of conflict. And notice we start with an antecedent over here on the far left-hand side. This sets up the parameters for the potential conflict. And then we move to the perceived conflict. In other words, a person perceives that this is a conflict. Now, remember, perception is not always reality, but usually is. So we have to go on that manner. So right now, it's still perceived. We have the antecedents. We have a perception of conflict. Now we come down to this felt conflict. So we have now we feel this in ourselves. We've got to do something about it. And then we move over to this manifest conflict stage. And here we are going to hopefully logically and dispassionately address the conflict. Notice the word I use, dispassionate. Address the conflict, and so it can get resolved, or it's going to be suppressed. Now, I must tell you that I do not like to use the word suppression. I wish that suppression would not even be mentioned here, because that's not something we want to do. So here we're just going to go back over what we talked about. This is the conflict antecedents. And then we're going to go down here to the next slide, which talks about the perceived conflict, which moves from perceived to felt. So we have something that's gone from I think this is to concrete, pretty much what we're saying here. But notice that the perceived is the basis to start this. Basis for either substantive or emotional. And then we come to the final, which is the manifest conflict. And this is the issue I said that I wish we had not talked about. And the reason why is because now we talk about here about conflict aftermath. We've either removed or eliminated the antecedents. So we've solved the issue. But conflict suppression doesn't do anything. It may be, and I stress the term may be, a short-term resolution to the problem. Well, let me stay away from resolution. Might be a short-term answer for the problem. But if we have something suppressed, we know that it's lying underneath the surface, and it may be bubbling or percolating. It's not boiling, but it might be bubbling or percolating, maybe steaming, whatever the right word here is. It's still there. And if we are at the suppressed stage, we haven't done anything. All we've done, we've said, okay, we've taken this issue and we brought it over here to a temporary holding area. And we're going to have to do one of two things. We're either going to have to go over there to the holding area, bring this thing back up and resolve it, or we're going to let it there, and it's probably going to come back that we don't want to address this thing again. Now, these are types of conflicts, and it causes the conflicts, and they're pretty easy here to talk about. We have vertical, horizontal, and line and staff. And vertical is pretty easy. It's usually between a subordinate, his or her superior, manager, supervisor, or whatever the right term you want to use there is. And there's some, it could be over goals and objectives. It could be over task completion. It could be over any number of things. It talks there about performance results. Of course, we can put that in there as well. Horizontal is going to be between two people or two groups or two teams at the same level. Level of authority, level of importance, et cetera, et cetera. So we're not going to have a up or down type thing. It's going to be this way. And then the final one is one that we have that is really fairly frequent in organizations. That's between the line and staff people. You really have an issue here because the staff people will come out and say, look, this is the way things need to be done. And the line folks said, Well, okay, that's fine. We're not going to do it that way. We're going to do it this way. And what the staff people need to understand is that they do not, I repeat, they do not have the authority to countermand what the line people are doing. They can say, you know, we give them the information, we give them the direction, we told them what to do. We can't make them do that. Now, a classic example of this, as far as I'm concerned, comes in the IT business. And many of us have run into the problem or the issue that the IT folks want to tell us how this stuff is made and how this works, et cetera, et cetera. And we, the users, we don't care about that. All we care about is tell us how this is going to work so we can do our jobs better. We don't care how it was made. We're not interested in it. That's not our business, because if it breaks down, we're going to have to call you back to fix it. So this is a classic example. Maybe I'm being personal here when I talk about that example, because it's happened to me in some cases. By the way, I'm not, and please do not misunderstand me, I'm not putting anybody down. I'm just telling you this is a friction, it's a conflict that happens, and I just use an example that I'm pretty familiar with. All right, now here's a little slide here. We talk about how we're going to try to manage this. And we look here, we have role ambiguity conflicts. We have task and workflow interdependencies, and then we have domain ambiguities. And so we can see some of this on page. By the way, I should have referred you one of the last slides to figure 10 points for in the textbook, and I'm sorry that I did not. It gives you some classic examples there of some issues between. It says structural differentiation is a potential source of conflict among functional teams, which would have been that horizontal level. So here we have role ambiguity, where somebody's not sure what he or she's supposed to do. It's unclear, it's unsettling, it's ambiguous, whatever. Task and workflow interdependencies. This happens when people have to work together. There's some interdependent relationship. I'm on one part of the assembly line, for instance, somebody up the other end of the assembly line is doing something, and I can't perform my function if what he or she does isn't correct. So we have this interdependency. I'm dependent upon them. They're probably dependent upon somebody else further up the line. And then the domain ambiguities, again, this is between this. Think of this as between departments. We don't have task direction. We don't understand goals, etc. So, and what happens here is we are liable to wind up with a result in a win-lose situation. And we're going to talk about win-lose a little bit later when we get to more into conflict. Well, this is another issue that we have to face, and it's very important here because we have things that we talked about already. One here, how we can manage our conflicts. Resource scarcity, we have to address that. It's not something that can actually be many times fixed. So we have to set priorities. Who gets the resources, what's needed, how do we handle this, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have this power or value asymmetries, and where there's differences. And so we have to figure that out. How are we going to work through that process? What's it going to make it different? We have something that's unequal, something that's different, that has to be addressed. Now, here we're going to come into some of the strategies. Next, we're coming to some of the strategies that we need to use to fix this. And the first ones we come to, I'm going to move this up just a little bit so we can see these, is a term. Now remember, what we're saying here, that the next 5 or 10 minutes that we're going to talk here is about indirect strategies. Somebody is, while this is being handled, and it is being handled by somebody, he or she is not directly doing something to doing something. So look here, it talks about in this first one, manage interdependencies, decoupling, unhitching and separating what the issues are. So that's think about that as removing them. It's like you would uncouple a freight car on a train to put it down a separate line to go where it's supposed to go. Then we have buffering is another approach where we're using the inputs of one team as the outputs of another team. Not used too often because this talks about increased inventory issues. And then another one is appealing to common goals. And here what we would do is we would simply say, hey, look, everybody, we've got to keep focused on what the goals and objectives are. This is just something we need to think about so that we're not looking at something else. You know, we're focused on the issue at hand, and we're not out here to the periphery. We're not going to try to solve those problems because that's not what we're here to solve. So this is what we want to do. This is how we're going to do it, and hopefully we'll get people, because we're focusing on the common goals that everybody's trying to get to, we'll get agreement here. Now we want to move along to some that are fairly simple here. Upward referral. You're just going to send that up to folks above you and let them solve. I don't particularly like this. And the reason I don't particularly like this is because you're now putting the monkey on somebody else's back, and that probably is not something he or she should do, even though they're at a higher level. This ought to be done where it's supposed to be. It ought to be issues and answers to issues, resolutions to issues that should be solved at the level at which they arise, not someplace else. Because eventually somebody's going to say, well, if you keep sending me your problems, why do I need you? So it's passing the monkey along to somebody else. Don't do that. I'm not saying sometimes you can't. I mean, sometimes it's impossible. You have to do that. You have to get those folks involved. Not always a good thing to do, but I don't think you ought to do this unless it's absolutely, positively, 100% necessary. Altering scripts and myths, we don't need to talk about this. This is exactly what it says. But remember, altering changes nothing. And we have to be careful about that. And we have to make sure that we're going to do this, that we get buy-in when we're doing this altering scripts and myths. If we get buy-in, okay. If we don't get buy-in, then we really haven't solved anything. Now, we are going to now come to the direct methods. I put the slide up here for you. I hope that you can read this. You can see it in figure 10.4 on page 229. And we're going to talk about each of these strategies because they're very important to think about and to discuss. And if you stop and think about this, you will see that each of these strategies has been used in your workplace at some time in your experience. Now, you may not have thought about them this way or have used the exact terms, but this is what we're into. Now, this is the first we're going to talk about, and this is lose-lose. Nobody wants to get to lose-lose because it's exactly what it says. Both parties in conflict wind up losing. Now, there are several strategies that are used in this, The first is avoidance. Absolutely what it says. If I avoid this situation, it's going to go away. And I don't get anything done. Notice it also says in the textbook that I'm downplaying disagreement. So, you know, what am I doing here? I'm not confronting this issue head on. Accommodation is also that way. It's also known as smoothing, and that is glossing over our issues. It's also playing down differences. In some cases, it's letting somebody else have his or her way. And then finally, we have compromise. Now, most of us, I think I'm probably going to repeat this again as we get later in today's lecture. Most of us have always thought of compromise as being something good. But notice that in compromise, each party to the conflict gives up something that he or she values. And so if you give up something that you really value to reach an agreement, what have you won here? Maybe that's a better term. What have you gained? I don't know if you could do one. What have you gained? I want to get that away from win business. What have you gained? You really haven't gained anything because you had to give something up to get something else, and you still got this thing you gave up, and somebody's going to ask you, why'd you give it up? It doesn't make any sense. So we don't want, you have to think about that. Win-lose conflict, we've got, it's like a sports contest. Somebody wins and somebody loses. Yeah, there are a couple of sports that can wind up in tie games. Soccer can, hockey can in some cases. Now, somebody's a winner, somebody's a loser, and the two types that we have in this situation are, pardon me, competition, which is obvious. We know what that is. We don't have to talk about competition because we've all been there in competition. And the other is authoritative command. And somebody just says, hey, this is the way it is. I understand your situation. I understand your situation, but here's what we're going to do. Now, most of the time, people may not like that because somebody is imposing the resolution. But it's not always bad because sometimes you have to have that. And sometimes it has to be the person, somebody in charge making that resolution so you can move on and go to other things besides being stuck in this conflict area with not getting anywhere for some period of time. Win-win conflict is simply the best result for everybody. So we're here, remember this one again focuses on issues. We try to reach a resolution based upon facing the issues. We could look at this as substantive or functional conflict or trying to do something. Notice it talks here that we have a shared desire. I couldn't think of the right word I wanted to use. A shared desire to fix the issue. And it's not something that we're going to let go away. Notice that people have to come to this in this situation with a sense of being cooperative. And then, of course, this high assertiveness does not mean to be nasty in your face. It just means that you're advocating your position. This is done by collaboration and problem solving, where we focus on issues and we're evaluating and things of that nature. We want to see everybody come out ahead in this type of situation. That's the best way to do it. Now, this is a question just to ask yourself, and I don't have an answer for this. Conflict you've had with a coworker. How was it handled? Was it direct or indirect? Was it resolved, or how was it resolved? What technique was used? Has the conflict come back? So those are kind of things for you to think about as an individual, and perhaps then you're ready to think about this conflict, pardon me, this conflict you had in a different perspective. And the next time it arises, you have some kind of an idea how to try to, or a similar one, to fix it. Now we're going to move on to the latter part of this chapter, and that's negotiation. This as a notice here is a joint decision-making process, and where we have two parties that have the conflict. They have different values, perhaps different priorities, etc. They have come together to try to negotiate a reasonable settlement, or settlement that is reasonable to both parties. So we have substance goals, and then we have relationship goals that need to be worked on while we're going through this negotiation. Substance could be things, the salary, working conditions, etc. Whereas relationships can be, can we continue as we want to continue? So and what I should say here is, and I didn't say, I misread my note. After we have finished the negotiation, are we going to be able to continue the relationship that we had prior to the negotiation? So it's important to have good relationships in the negotiation, even though each side is different. You can still have a good relationship. You know, it's the old story. You can disagree, but don't be disagreeable. And that's what we're talking about here. And then you want to make sure that when you come out of this, there is a good relationship. The relationship has not been destroyed. If you destroyed a relationship, well, the negotiation probably was, I won't say worthless, but certainly you didn't get what you wanted out of it. Here are these are the effective negotiation strategies that you have to use. There has to be quality. And we have to focus here on a win-win situation. So where each side has something that's satisfactory to him or her, or to the parties, depending upon what happens to be, that they can take back to their constituents if they have them and say, this is what we've been able to do. Harmony. This goes back to the relationships. You know, you don't want to destroy things that are going on. You want to keep those relationships good. You want to focus on issues. And when you focus on issues, you're not getting into personalities and he said, she said, and somebody else said. Focus on it. And then efficiency. You'll want to make sure the negotiation stays on track. Especially if you're management and labor, it's costly to be in those negotiations. Somebody from management's coming in, they're paying his or her salary. Somebody from the union's coming, and the union is paying that person to be there. And those people are being taken away from their normal jobs. So effective negotiation, efficient negotiation, timely, don't waste resources. Resources here are both money and people's time. Now this is just paramount. We talked about ethics in decision making last week. We brought ethics up earlier in the course. We're going to talk about it later in the course. We have a case study later on that talks about maybe ethics and how people do things, etc. So you have to behave in a manner that you'd be proud of. You know, this desire of one-upmanship is not something that necessarily, well, I shouldn't say necessarily, it doesn't promote good negotiation. There's one-upmanship or gotcha business. You know, that's childish. and you don't need to be doing that because it's not going to work. People are going to see through it, and it just stay away from it. Because if we don't have ethical negotiations, then we're going to have problems later on. Now, these are just some different types of negotiation that we see. Two-party negotiation, one-on-one, could be and we're going to show this later in the in tonight in a different way, but it's somebody negotiating a starting salary. So that's what we're talking about here. Group negotiation is exactly what it says when negotiations going on between the team members. One of the things that you may see in this type of negotiation is that the team leader, use the term manager here on the slide, is actually working as a facilitator. He or she is trying to keep the negotiation going on. Now, this could be over roles, it could be over tasks, it could be over a number of things. Enter a group. Here you're negotiating with somebody else. Again, they use the term manager here. We can exchange that for team leader. And then constituency would be an example I gave before, where you have management and labor negotiation. Management is they're negotiating on the behalf of the company. It could be negotiating on behalf of the board of directors because they're going to approve the salary, are going to approve the terms of the negotiation. And then the representatives from labor are there representing their union members. So it's something larger than just those two people. Now we have a couple of concepts we're going to talk about here. One is distributive negotiation. And notice here what this says. This is where people are focused on staying with their declared objectives, positions, if you would prefer to. And so you have, this is what I want, this is what I'm willing to give you, which may not be anywhere close, and we're going to stay with this. Whereas integrative negotiation, and notice it says here, it's many times called principled negotiation because we're focusing on the merits of the issue. We're not focusing on staked out positions because staked out positions don't always last. Somebody has to come someplace to make some sort of a negotiation. If you stay with stakeout, you're not going to get to where you want to be. So here's distributive negotiation. You can see distributive mentioned in your text on pages 232 and 233. Notice it's focused on what can I get. The hard distributive negotiation, there are really two kinds, hard and soft. Hard is back to our win-lose situation. There's going to be a winner, there's going to be a loser, and perhaps we're going to have a lot of bad feelings once the negotiation is over, because notice there, each party is holding out for his or her objective. And what happens in these cases is eventually somebody's just going to get the upper hand for whatever reason. In soft distributive negotiation, notice here it's called lose-lose. One party might just cave in and say, okay, well, you can, I'm going to let you have your way. And it could also result in a compromise where each party gives up something of value. Remember, we talked about that before. What usually happens here with the party or person, if you prefer, who gives in to this other person or other party, we're going to have this, back to this bubbling underneath the surface here. And there's going to be some pent up resentment that probably is not going to go away. And it's just one of those things. Notice what this slide says. One of the parties tries to find a way to satisfy this other party. And, you know, that's just not a good tactic, because even if you do that and you're trying to say, oh, well, let's get this thing over with, I want to, you know, least amount of turmoil as possible, you're going to walk away from that type of thing and say, you know, this really wasn't good for anybody. It wasn't good for me. It wasn't good for the people I represent, et cetera, et cetera. So there's going to be this little animosity, if you will, still continuing. It's not going to get any better. The next thing we talk about here, by the way, we'll get a little bit more about integrative negotiation in a second, is the bargaining zone. And the best way to show that, but the bargaining zone is shown very well in figure 10.5 at the bottom of page 233. And what it says is that's a range between one party's minimum reservation and the other party's maximum reservation. So we look down here. The example is a kid coming out of college trying to find a new job, and he or she's going to negotiate, and he wants or she wants to say, I'm worth $60,000, and the organization says $45,000, but the actual bargaining zone is between $50,000 and $55,000. So what that means is each are going to move somewhere toward the middle, and then that 50 to 55,000 is the actual bargaining zone. Those other two were starting points. They were never the bargaining zone. Now we move to integrative negotiation. And notice here, how can we do this? It's not confrontational. It broadens the alternatives. A win-win solution is always possible, and it focuses on issues, not personalities. But very important we think about this. And people come to this with a sense of trust. So it's very important to think about that. And we'll see this on the next slide here. It's good attitude. There's a willingness to share information. There's a willingness to ask concrete questions and get concrete answers. So people have come to this with an idea of having something that's equitable. Again here, behavioral. We're not talking about people. We're talking about issues. We're keeping emotions away. We're looking for common interests. What is it we can do to get in common? We're going to look at all the alternatives. We're going to judge them based upon facts and information that's been provided. So that's the thing. And then finally, we have at the beginning decided how are we going to evaluate these answers, these alternatives we come up with, and we've decided on a set of standards. Informational. We talked a little bit about this. Everybody has to understand what's there. Know your issue. What's important. What happens if there's no agreement, and then understand the other person and his or her side of the issues. That's very, very important. Here's some things we can think about in this, that there's a myth of the fixed pie, or ways that we can maneuver that pie around a little bit. We have to be careful about escalating commitment. That's, continuing to do things after we probably should have said, hey, enough's enough. Overconfidence can always be a killer. We really have to be careful about that. It's just not something that we need to be fixed into. And then last here, we're going to get to this in the next chapter. That's too much talking. It says telling here, but I'm going to say too much talking and not enough listening. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about are third-party negotiations. This is where somebody comes in, and this person is a neutral. He or she has no preconceived issues or problems, and they're going to listen to both sides. One, we have a person who is an arbitrator, and this person listens to both sides of the issue, listens to both presentations, but the arbitrator acts as judge and jury, and his decision or her decision is final and firm. Now, that's for people who agree to use arbitration. We see this in negotiation of sports contracts on a routine basis. The problem with this is there is a winner and a loser. There is no middle ground. And then the last one we're going to talk about is the mediation. There are federal mediators. They work for the government. They're called in to keep talks going, and they will go from side to side. A shuttle is sometimes used, and they'll bring positions back. And this person said this, and this person said that. Here's a counter offer, and so on and so forth. Their purpose is to keep things moving, keep people talking, etc., etc. They do not have authority to render a decision. So those are different. So arbitrator can make a decision, mediator cannot. And at 5:49, and as you know, I'm late tonight because I was running into technical difficulties. We've reached a conclusion. So we're going to take a 5-minute break here and come back at 5:54, and we'll talk about chapter 11. Please come back at 5:54. Actually, we're only going to get about 4.5 minutes. Yeah, take care. All right, it is 5:54. We're back. I'm sorry. We're now into Chapter 11, Communication and Collaboration. And we hope to answer these questions as we go through this chapter. What is communication? We all know what it is, but we're going to hopefully learn a little bit more about it. What are the issues in interpersonal communication? What is the nature of communication in organizations? And then finally, how can we build more collaborative work environments? Well, communication. I'm going to say it a little bit different than it is on the slide. We tell in various ways, through writing, through voice, through face-to-face. The Indians years ago did it with smoke signals. Tell someone else or someone's else something in various ways. So we're going to tell them something, and what we send them, message, has meaning. Now this is the communication process. And as you see on the left-hand side of your screen, we have the source. That's the person who sends the message in some fashion. A letter writer, although I understand that the younger generation is not much into writing letters these days, and are even, in fact, using the United States Postal Service. And it's not meant to be a smart remark. It's meant to be a statement of fact. So this person not only sends the message, he or she puts some meaning into the message. They use the term encode. And then we send that message over to the receiver over here on the right-hand side through some type of channel. We'll talk about the channels a little bit later in this chapter. And then the receiver has two tasks at hand. First of all, he or she has to make meaning of the message. Decode the message first, I guess is a better way to say that. And once that that person has gotten that message out to where it makes, it looks like it has meaning, then they put meaning to the message. Understand what happens. Now, one of the problems that we run into in this sending this message and receiving this message or messages is we have distractors. And distractors are known as noise. And the noise can be anything that somehow changes the message or distorts the message or causes some problems with the message. So we know that the message isn't complete. So it can be, notice there's a number of them to talk about here. I think we're going to have another slide to mention those. By the way, here we're back into this particular slide. We're away from figure 11.1, and we're now talking about the different type, the source receiver, and the noise we talked about, anything that breaks up the communication. Here are communication channels that we talk about, and we know what they are. Face to face, we're doing this. This is kind of a video teleconferencing here that I'm doing with you. You have the opportunity to join live, or you can watch a recording. Now, if you join live, you can send me a message, and I can see the message down there. I can respond to you in the chat room box down here on the right-hand side. If you watch the recording, which I'll upload tomorrow, you don't have an opportunity to, at that time, ask me questions. You can watch them and then send me an email and say, hey, this is what I understood you to say, and did you really mean this? So other ways we can do this: telephone, written letters, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I want to go back to the first slide, the slide here, and talk just a little bit about some of these barriers, some of this noise business, and we'll point these out and then ask you to keep them in your mind, because they'll come up later as we go through, and it we'll be able to, I think, address those. So we have mixed messages, we have semantic barriers, we have physical disturbances, we don't have feedback, and then one here's status affects one person superior to the other person, whether or not that's going to get across. I remember when I was in the Army and I was serving in St. Louis, we had a colonel there. He was a nice guy, but he was pretty good size. I don't mean he was overweight or anything like that, but he was probably about 6'2" or 6'3", and fairly muscular. And he did a lot of body language talking. And he would, and I don't think if he were here today, he would agree with what I'm going to say, but he would intimidate people by his body size. And so this is kind of what we're talking about, these distortions, if you will, distractions, this noise. That's something that causes issues. This is a real big issue, this feedback. And we're going to talk about this again as we go through this chapter. And this is where the receiver comes back to the sender and says, this is what I heard you say. Or this is what I heard you send me by email or by some other method. And the feedback ought to, in some cases, say, we're not going to talk about another type of feedback that I'm going to get to here when we go through the active listening part. But this feedback should say, is this really what you meant to say? Or you say, or you just say, this is what I heard you say, this is what I understood you to say, and then let that person clear it up. But when we don't get that feedback, the communication loop is not closed. It's still open. It's a message that's been sent. It may be a message that's been received, but it's not been interpreted, it's not been acted upon, and there's no agreement between the sender and the receiver as to what was said and what was expected. Now, here are some potential barriers to feedback in the workplace, and I think these are things that, pardon me, that we really have to be concerned about. We can have unintended consequences. This is where somebody, the hackles on the back of somebody's neck are going to get raised because of the email that was sent in or something else. And have you ever been guilty about that? I had a student just go back a few years ago, and I really wasn't a student. I was doing some advising in those days as well as instructing. And I had this student, and he was not within a business student, but I picked up because somebody else was out, or we were short-staffed or something. I don't remember the thing. And he sent me an email on Saturday. I got it on a Saturday. It really torqued me out of shape. And so without thinking, I responded in kind. And he was like, "You're the worst person on this earth since Hitler or Stalin or somebody else." So that's one of the things we have to do too, is think first before we act and react. And I use myself as an example because I probably compounded a problem. I probably should have just said, I'm not going to worry about this thing. It's not that big of an issue. Or passed it off to my dean, who might have been able to handle it. I sent the dean a copy of what I did, and he thought it was okay. We probably both really sat down and talked about it. Improper wording. we don't think that what we said is going to cause any problems. Now, this is a little different from up above. So we have to be careful about the words that we use, and how we think they're going to be received, and in some cases, how they're going to be perceived. And then here in the performance appraisal process, the key to this is, first of all, let me tell you that I don't know any supervisor that likes it, or manager, if you prefer that term. I don't know any person who is on the receiving end likes it, even if it turns out to be okay. There's always some apprehension there. What you want to do is you want to focus first on what's been done well. Then you want to focus on perhaps goals and objectives for the next year or the next period, whatever it happens to be, and then talk about things that need to be worked on to be improved. Stress the positive first, and then let the other stuff catch up with you later. This is a big issue, and I'm going to give you another one of the things that I did that I was guilty of at a meeting when I was in the Army. And this is the nonverbal cues and clues that we have to be careful about doing. And this particular one that I'm going to bring up is something that I did. And but what we're talking about here is how people stand, whether they fold their arms. You know, this is the old the arms akimbo thing that you're really not interested in listening to what anybody has to say. You're closed, whether that means it that way or not. A lot of people interpret that way. Whether a person makes eye contact with you or not, other type movements that they do. One of the things we have to be careful about is the message that we're sending this way verbally. We want to make sure matches what we're actually doing physically. And then this other part down here, presence, is active speaking without using words. Well, this is what I did. I was in a meeting. This was up at the five-sided Puddle Palace on the shores of the Potomac River, and we were in a small office, and the colonel was having a staff meeting, and he hadn't been there very long. And somebody got started on something, and I had heard this thing about 3 or 4 times. I didn't think it had any merit. Other people didn't think it had merit, and yet we're going to hear it again. So I'm at the other end of this table, and I'm by the door, and I just turned my back. And I don't know how many people saw that, but the colonel did. And when we were finished with the meeting, he asked me to stay, and he said, "Don't do that again." And he said, he repeated what I couldn't tell him I didn't. I know I did. And I said, well, the reason I did that was because I didn't want to show that I was disgusted at hearing this thing again. He said, it doesn't make any difference. You don't turn your back. So that's what we're talking about. My body language says I don't want to hear this. And that was true, of course. I didn't want to hear it. I heard it before. This is an issue here that I want to show you. This is figure 11.2 in your text. You can see at the bottom of page 244. And this is the nonverbal communication. The only thing that I'll let you figure this out, what this is telling the person that walks in the door. The only thing I would say to you is there's nobody that starts off a conversation by saying, I'm the boss. Everybody knows that that person is the boss, and he or she doesn't have to remind an underling, to use a term, of what their position is. So I'll let you look at this. This is what's known as proximetics. We've talked about this before, position of things in offices to make you one way or another. Talk about here, I'm facing a wall. I have a PC in front of me. There's a fairly good size open window that you can look into my glass pane. You can look into my office. Now, when I want to talk to people come to my office. I have a little round table here behind me, which you might be able to see. Most of the time we sit there and talk. Sometimes somebody will come into me and I'll just have a seat, I'll just turn my chair around and kind of scoot over there. But most of the time I'll sit over there and talk. Depends upon what the issues are. Interpersonal barriers. This happens when we lack objectivity to hear the message that's being delivered. That's what I pleaded guilty to before. Turn my back. Wasn't an interpersonal, that was a personal, but I did the same thing. With two things coming here. One's selective hearing and the other is filtering. Selective hearing is simply hearing what we want to hear and nothing else. So we hear parts of the message, and the other parts of the message we either don't like, pardon me, or we discount, saying, okay, we're not going to let those in. Those are out. And the other one is filtering, but this is a little bit different. We're only going to convey the parts of the message that we want to tell somebody. So we're not going to tell the whole truth. Now, again, I want to use the situation I came. I'll give you this. This is my favorite. This happened to me many, many years ago. I was in the Army, and we were in exercise, and we had been asked by the host organization to stand a courtesy inspection because they were going to go through a large inspection. They were getting ready to be deployed. And so we agreed to do that. And we wanted to have all the soldiers up and ready early the next morning. Well, without getting into a long story about what happened, that was my responsibility to get them up. I didn't get up. And consequently, they didn't get up. By the time I realized what time it was, I had got them up. Get your uniforms on and get dressed and shower and shave if you have to, and whatever else, and get to where you're supposed to be. So we used to have a staff meeting right before lunch every day, which would be about 11:30 or so. And the commander was a physician. And I have to back up. So when I got to to what we used to call the mess hall, dining facility now, the executive officer asked me if the commander and his aide showed up. And I said, I didn't see them. Now notice what I said. I didn't say they weren't there. I didn't say I overslept. I said I didn't see them. And so we had the staff meeting, and the commander came in and with 2 or 3 other things. And he said, by the way, I just wanted to say the men were very quiet this morning. And the executive officer looked at me and he said, Reed, he said, I thought you said they didn't show up. I said, no, sir, that's not what I said. I said I didn't see them. Well, I cracked them up. And when the commander understood that, I had told the commander in the meantime what had happened the night before and what caused the delay, et cetera, et cetera. And somebody one of our soldiers had an emergency, and I had to see it got taken care of, and I didn't get to bed till late. No excuse, but that's what happened. But the executive office thought it was funny, and everybody else kind of got along. But I didn't not tell the truth. I didn't tell the truth I didn't tell the exact truth. All I said was I didn't see them. Absolutely true. But was that the message I should have said? No, absolutely not. And we have other things that are really, really, really big problems. And that mentions here in your text. And these are physical distractions. Yes, things. Well, we've scheduled a meeting, but the phone rings, or a secretary walks in, or administrative assistant, I guess, the better way of putting it today. Or the guy you're having the meeting with looking through their notes about something else. And so we've been put off. And the point is, this doesn't make any sense. Why are we doing this? So that's some type of a physical distraction. Semantic barriers are something that always gets us into trouble. This is a poor use of words that send a mixed message. And you can look at a very good example on page 246. I'm not going to read it to you. The object is, and what they're trying to get across here is the next thing is the KISS principle. Keep it short and simple. I've heard it used other ways. Keep it simple, stupid. However you want to use it, it's fine. You know, you don't use words that you don't need to use. Make sure that the meaning that you want to say is conveyed and not something else. Now we're going to get to perhaps one of my favorite issues here, favorite topics in this chapter, and that's active listening. By the way, you can see the active listening, these typical things explained here on page 247 at the bottom. The first thing I want to tell you about active listening is that you're paying attention. So it talks about listening for content. That's what I'm talking about, paying attention. Everything that's said in the message does not have to get the same attention everything else does. You have to get the salient points. If you've ever learned anything about speed, this is like speed reading. If you've ever learned anything about speed reading, the object of speed reading is that you read the first sentence in a paragraph and the last sentence in a paragraph, because those are the two most important sentences in a paragraph. Most everything else is fluff. So if you get the first and the last, you get what's being said. You want to listen to any feelings that are being given. There's just some emotion there. How's this person feel about it? So you get that, paying attention, and then you want to respond to that. Let that person know that that's how you're responding. You understand that. It doesn't mean to say that you like that. It just means you're responding to it. Note what he or she does physically. You know, it does the message, or is the message backed up by the body language? And then paraphrase. That means you give back to that person, this is what I understood you to say. And so you're actually creating not only feedback for him, but you're starting the loop over so that person can come back and say, okay, well, let's clarify this. Now, I want to digress here a second. I was first exposed to Schermerhorn, used one of his textbooks. Unfortunately, he's one of the authors of this text, the primary author, with a textbook that I used about close to 20 years ago. His management textbook, and I've used several of his editions since then. I still have the 5th edition at home. Most of the other editions I've not kept, but the 5th edition was the first textbook I used when I started doing some teaching back in the late 1990s. And these are John Schermerhorn's 10 steps to good listening. The first step and the last step are the same, and I'm going to exclude those. Some of what we've just talked about is going to be repeated here and reemphasized. Put the person at ease. Show that you want to listen. Remove any potential distortions, distractions, whatever it happens to be. You know, if you're having a meeting in your office with somebody, put the phone on whatever it happens to be, put it on ignore or whatever that right term is. Tell whoever it is, you don't have to be disturbed or whatever. You want to empathize with a person. Let's look going back here to the feelings and responding to feelings. Don't respond too quickly. Be patient. And that allows you to hear what's being said and to listen to what's being said. Don't get angry. And don't show anger. Make sure you hold your temper. I mean, it may be difficult, but you want this to have a positive outcome, and so you have to work in that fashion. Go easy on argument and criticism. Make sure you do that, and make sure that you ask questions. Now, What are his first and last steps? Stop talking. One of the problems that we have is that, and this is not necessarily in the stopping talking, but it follows that. We're listening to someone, hopefully we are, not just hearing, listening to someone deliver a message, or we're reading a message on text or email or whatever, and we're so interested in what our response is going to be, we stop paying attention to the message and we formulate the response in our brain. So we don't get everything. Men are particularly worse than women are at this. So listen to everything that's being said. Read the email or the text before you respond. And maybe count to 10 before you respond as well. Now, this is some problems. This next couple of slides are going to introduce some problems that we have with communication. And that comes from our backgrounds. Ethnocentrism is our tendency to believe that our culture is and values are superior to anybody else's. So you got to check that at the door before you start. And then the other thing here is that your cross-cultural communication, you really have to be careful about what you're doing. You know, in the United States, when we say something is good, or at least people of my age did for many years, it would give a figure like that. Thumb and index finger together. Okay. You don't do that in many places in Europe. You want to say something's okay or it's good, you put your thumb up. And most Europeans are, that's what most of, well, for a long time, most of the stock in the United States came from Europe. It's probably not, it's not as true today as it used to be, and it's not going to be true 10 years into the future. But, so you have to be careful about that. And that's the use of gestures. I mean, just besides the language difference, you really have to be careful about that. And then, of course, parochialism is thinking my way is the only way. Can't do anything other than that. And then here is the thing we talked about a little bit before, I believe, the low text culture, low context cultures, and high text context cultures. Low context would be people in the United States and other English-speaking countries such as Canada and Australia, where the message that we are sending is embedded in however we're delivering it, by word, by writing, or whatever. It's contained there. Whereas the high context cultures, that's not true. Only part of the message is being delivered through the written or spoken word, and the rest has to be inferred from context. Now, those high context cultures would be Asian cultures and those from the Middle East. You just have to be careful what you're doing here, and as our workplace changes, it's very important we pay attention to that. Well, there's nothing really exciting on this slide. We have a couple of channels within organizations to get out the word. The formal channel, we know what that is. That usually flows from top to bottom, although it could flow a couple other ways, but there's formal lines of communication within the organization. And notice it says hierarchy and authority there, so that's what we're talking about. Informal channels don't adhere to any hierarchy. We have those, and we have to acknowledge the fact that they're there, and we have to make sure that they are doing the things that they're supposed to do. Now, that sounds kind of strange, because if it's informal, what's it supposed to do? Well, sometimes we use the informal the informal channels, especially the one I'm going to pull up right now, the Grapevine, to get information out because we want to get it out quickly. The problem with doing that is that it does not have the cachet of authority behind it. That's one. And two, it isn't always delivered the way we want it delivered. So you have to be careful about using the Grapevine. I like to call it the rumor mill. We had too many of those when I was in the Army. And partly we tried to make sure we kept them to a minimum. So know that they're there, know that they work, be certain that the best you can that you can control the message that's being delivered through those channels, if you will, and realizing that you're setting yourself up for some potential difficulty if you use them. Now this next slide begins the first of channel richness, and then we're going to move to the channel richness. And this just talks about the capacity of the communication that can be handled by a particular channel. And this slide, the next slide, and by the way, you can see this on page 252, figure 11.3. And it shows here the richness of each channel, which means how much information is going to get through and the way you want to get it through. And notice that face-to-face is at the top of the list. And then you do have video conferences and things of that nature. And then we go to the telephone and all the way down to postings and e-bulletins and things of that nature. Understand that the best, the richest is face-to-face. Understand that it is slow because you're limited to the number of people in the audience. And now, if you are speaking to a group of people, and if there's not some interaction allowed in that, that's not the same as that is part of face-to-face, but it's not quite the same. So we have to be careful about what we want to do. By the way, does not mean to say that postings, e-bulletins, etc. Should not be used. I just understand that they're not as rich as this other one. But if you want to reach a wide audience, that's what you're going to use, something down in that area. Now this next one is just showing us how information flows in organizations. This is figure 11.4 found on the next page, page 253. We really don't have a whole lot that we need to say here. We know that when it comes down from on high, those folks will tell us about perhaps strategy, changes in goals and objectives. Maybe they're giving us some kind of report of things that were done, etc. When we have lateral communication, that's normally done as peer-to-peer or something of that nature. It could be peer-to-manager, especially if you're working in a team where you would be where you would have a team leader. And then upward communication, you're going to send issues up, maybe problems up. Otherwise, as you know, I don't like that. We may be sending information about what we've done and what our progress on projects is. And then, of course, we may ask questions, etc., and things of that nature. The reason I don't like to send problems up, again, as I mentioned before, is you're passing on your monkey to somebody else. You ought to solve that. And then coming from the Army, we were always taught you never gave a superior a problem or an issue unless you provided him or her a solution. So it's just something that I'm more comfortable with. Doesn't mean to say I'm right or wrong. It's just I don't like to send problems up. Doesn't mean to say they don't have to be, but if you can solve them, don't be sending them up for somebody else to answer. If you can't solve them, yeah, I mean, maybe it's out of your bailiwick. You can't do anything about it. But pay a little bit of attention to that before you go send them up and asking somebody else to take care of that. And this is just repeating what we just talked about, so I'm not going to discuss that slide any longer. And then again, this gives us a little bit more information here about downward communication and upward communication in the lateral. Again, that's something we need to spend a lot of time on because it's pretty self-explanatory. Now, here we come to what what technology has done for us. It's helped us improve speed and capacity. It's helped give many more people access. It has encouraged sharing of information. So that has really helped us do a lot of things. And at the same time, it's also allowed companies to save resources because now they don't need as many people in the middle passing on information commonly known as the middle manager. Well, as I've said before, and I'll repeat, you're probably tired of hearing me say this, anytime you have something with advantages, there have to be downsides. The personal is removed in many cases for this because think of all the emails you get. I don't know if the organization you use, or that you work in uses text messages or some other method of sending information, but it's impersonal. We can't visualize, and we don't visualize the person who's sending that message. We don't see the nonverbal cues and clues. We sometimes get too much information. It's not easily translated and are understood. One of the biggest problems we have in the communication issue is we are inundated today, and I'm only talking about organizations, I'm not talking about outside organizations. We are inundated with information. And a lot of us, and I'm not necessarily putting myself in this category, a lot of us spend too much time trying to figure out what's good and what's not good. So we have to pay attention to that. And that causes some issues. Now here's some other problems we have with communication, and those are status differences. And you know, here you're going to give some information to the person above you, and because he or she's a rank or two ahead of you, I used to use that term as it's easy to use, has a higher position, is a better way of saying that. It may cause some problems with frankness of communication. And then the next thing that comes along with that is this thing called the mum effect. And this is simply the fear of passing on bad news, that you don't want to do that. And that's the next thing that comes along with that is because you're the messenger, you don't want to get shot for delivering the message. And we're going to see that as we work case 11, the poorly informed walrus. A very interesting case, and it talks just exactly about what we're talking about here. Now, here we moved past the actual communication that we talked about and been speaking about for the last 40 plus minutes. And we are now talking here about collaboration. Remember, we talked about back in the conflict settlement area, direct strategies to settle a conflict, collaboration and problem solving. So that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about collaborating with people. Notice it talks about boundaryless flows of information. We want things to be more open, more transparent. That's the object of this mushrooming information. Transparency is something that we like to do. Transparency is something that we're kind of built upon in the United States, although many times we think our government, I'm speaking of the federal government, is not as transparent as it ought to be. And I don't want to get into politics here. and I'm not particularly thinking of any one special administration, but I think that's a general comment. We're not as transparent, not as open as what we ought to be. So that's what this is talking about. It's talking about fostering communications, talking about fostering supportive environments. Interactional transparency. And I don't think we need to talk too much more about this, but this talks about openness, what I was talking about before. It talks about getting information with meaning, and it talks about feedback. All important components of this transparency, and this is what we needed to be. And otherwise, we're not going to go and be where we want to be. Supportive communication principles addresses issues, not people. We talked about this throughout tonight. Conflict and negotiation. We talk about issues. We don't want to talk about people. We're focusing on issues. We're interested in problem solving issues, not people. We got to get the personalities at the door. Get to the point. Don't generalize. Avoid words like never and always. It's not something that it's going to help us. Be personal or personable, as I think is personal and personable. Make sure that your language matches your nonverbal cues and clues. Maybe you want to use the term there. There's a thing that we talked about back in chapter 4 about reinforcement. And when somebody was working overtime, saw the boss smile, but at the same time he made a disparaging remark. I think they used the male pronoun. And so the next time that person saw the boss, and I think they used the she there, she cringed. Because even though he smiled the time before, he said something that wasn't very nice. So this is what matching up here, being congruent, making sure that whatever you're doing with your body language, you're matching with what you're saying, and vice versa. Own the communication. It's yours. It doesn't belong to anybody else. It's what you want to say, how you want to say it, and what you want it to do. So that's very important. I kind of want to conclude here with the second bullet about being specific and descriptive and not global. There used to be a bumper sticker that was very popular. I think it was back in the 1980s and 1990s. That said, "Think globally, but act locally." So maybe we can take this out a little bit. You may want to think about the big picture, and that's all well and good because we have to keep the big picture in mind. But let's focus on what's important. Excuse me, I've got a little gnat flying around here. Let's focus on what's important. Let's not go out here in this universe type thing and think we're going to solve those problems. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to be working in a collaborative environment. So those are the things that are very important. They're important to me. I hope that you can do that. Remember, one of the things we have to do in any communication is to break down barriers. We can't afford to have barriers. That just does not help us. So we need to do whatever it is we need to do those things. It's like this. If you're a manager and you're talking to a subordinate, if at all possible, try to be on the same level. Now, I'm talking about you're both standing, you're both sitting, you're both relaxed, whatever that happens to be, so that you're not doing this thing as this my way or the highway technique. I'm not trying to tell you, and don't mean to intimate that sometimes that's not necessary. But if you're looking for communication where people are going to get meaning out of what you're saying, and they're going to participate, and they're going to give you feedback, and they're going to respond to what you say, then we have to communicate in the fashion where people aren't defensive, and where it's open. and we can have good feedback and meaningful feedback. And we know what we're saying. Otherwise, we're doomed to having frustration after frustration after frustration. Well, I thank you very much for your attendance tonight. Next week, we're going to get into what are always, I think, two very important chapters, chapter 12 and 13. Chapter 12, power and politics, and then chapter 13, leadership essentials. I thank you for your attention this evening. I will have the video recorded. It's being recorded now. We're just about ready to shut down. And I'll have that uploaded tomorrow, both to YouTube and embedded with the lecture notes there for week 5. So I thank you for your attention and good night.